A poor black man helped a woman in trouble without knowing that she was the judge who would decide his fate. Mr. Wells, the jury finds you guilty of embezzlement and document falsification. The sentence will be 5 years in prison without bail. The gavel echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, sealing the fate that Jerome Wells already knew was sealed from the moment he dared to report his boss's corruption. But this story didn't begin in that stifling courtroom. It began 3 weeks earlier on a dark road during a storm that would change everything. Jerome was driving his 2008 Corolla down Highway 15, returning from his third job of the week. At 34, this State University trained accountant was working as a night security guard to pay the bills after he discovered that his boss, Richard Blackstone, had embezzled $2.3 million from the construction company where he had worked for 7 years. Rain pounded the windshield when he saw the emergency lights flashing dimly on the shoulder. A black BMW was stopped and a middle-aged woman was desperately trying to make calls next to the vehicle. Completely soaked, Jerome slowed down. Every fiber of common sense screamed at him to keep driving. A black man stopping to help a white woman on a deserted road at 2 o'clock in the morning. His father had taught him that this kind of kindness could be interpreted very differently depending on who was watching. But his mother's voice echoed in his mind. Jerome, character isn't about what you do when it's convenient. It's about what you do when it costs you something. He stopped. Do you need help? He shouted from the window, keeping a respectful distance and his hands visible. The woman turned, clearly startled. For a moment, Jerome saw the fear in her eyes. That automatic reflex he knew all too well. But something in his posture, in the calm way he spoke, made her relax slightly. "My car just died," she shouted back over the noise of the rain. "And my cell phone has no signal here." Jerome got out of the car, instantly soaking wet. "Can I take a look at the engine?" She hesitated once more, studying him, even wet and wearing the safety uniform that Marx Workers' Society prefers not to see. There was something about Jerome that conveyed confidence. Maybe it was the way he kept a respectful distance, or how his eyes revealed intelligence and education that contrasted with the prejudices she didn't even know she carried. "Please," she said finally. 15 minutes later, Jerome had diagnosed and fixed the problem. A loose battery cable probably caused by a pothole. His hands, calloused from working 3 jobs, moved with precision as he explained what he was doing. "There, try it now." The engine purred back to life. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, already reaching for her wallet. "Nothing. I'm just glad I could help." Jerome was already heading back to his car, eager to get home before Amelia woke up and noticed he hadn't come home from work yet. "Wait," she shouted. "At least tell me your name so I can thank you properly." He stopped in the drizzling rain. "Jerome Wells." "Thank you so much, Jerome Wells. You may have saved my night." If only she knew, Jerome thought as he drove home. You may have saved my life. 3 weeks later, sitting in that courtroom with handcuffs on his wrists, Jerome finally understood why his instincts had been on edge all week. There was something familiar about Judge Kendall Morrison's voice when she announced his sentence. Something that made his stomach freeze with a mixture of impossible hope and absolute terror. For one insane moment, he wondered if that authoritative voice could be the same one that had thanked him so warmly in the rain 3 weeks ago. But that would be impossible, wouldn't it? If you're enjoying this story of how an act of kindness can change destinies, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because sometimes the universe has plans that even injustice can't destroy. Jerome's life collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm. A week after the sentence, he lost his security job. "We can't keep a convicted criminal on the payroll," said the manager without even looking up from his computer. In the second week, the apartment owner showed up with an eviction notice in his hands. "Nothing personal, but I have a reputation to uphold." Amelia, his 8-year-old daughter, didn't understand why they had to move into the tiny room in Dona Esperanza's house, or why Daddy cried in the bathroom, thinking she couldn't hear him. "Is Daddy sad because people are being mean to him at work?" she asked one night, her curly locks framing her big, worried eyes. "Sometimes, sweetie, good people go through hard times," Jerome replied, hugging her too tightly. How could he explain to a child that the justice system had failed? That her father, who had graduated cum laude in accounting from the state university, was being destroyed for daring to report corruption. Meanwhile, Richard Blackstone was celebrating. Jerome found out from a former colleague that Richard had bought a beach house in Malibu the same month he was convicted. He said he finally got rid of the little problem that was getting in the way of business, said Mike, the engineer who still worked at Blackstone Construction, whispering over the phone. What hurt the most was the arrogance. Richard had sent Jerome a text message the day after the sentencing. I hope you've learned not to stick your nose where it doesn't belong. Some lessons are expensive. A.B. Jerome saved the message. He wasn't sure why. The truth about the embezzlement was more sinister than Jerome had initially realized. Richard hadn't just stolen money. He had created an elaborate scheme of overbilling on public contracts, specifically on low-income housing projects. Schools, health clinics, daycare centers. Every dollar embezzled was a dollar less for communities that already had so little. Jerome had discovered it by chance while conducting a routine audit. The numbers didn't add up. Phantom suppliers, overpriced materials, non-existent labor. When he presented his findings to Richard, expecting gratitude for having detected the problem, he received only a cold smile. Jerome, you're a good employee, Richard had said that day, leaning back in the leather chair of his panoramic office. But sometimes we see things that aren't there. Work stress. How about a vacation? A week later, Jerome was accused of being the perpetrator of the embezzlement himself. The perfect system. Richard had manipulated the digital records, created a trail of false evidence, even forged signatures. And when Jerome tried to defend himself, everyone saw just another black employee trying to blame the respected white boss of the community. Come to think of it, Richard had said during the trial, adjusting his expensive tie while giving testimony, there was always something suspicious about Jerome's behavior. Very interested in financial matters, always asking questions. I should have paid attention to the signs. The jury bought the whole story, but Jerome wasn't who Richard thought he was. The son of a nurse who worked 2 shifts to pay for his education, and a mechanic who taught him that character is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Jerome had grown up understanding that the world would not be fair to him. That's why he studied so hard. That's why he documented everything meticulously. That's why he had a habit of backing up everything. A quirk his colleagues thought was paranoia. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was wisdom. 3 months after his conviction, Jerome was working as a pizza delivery boy. His salary barely covered Dona Esperanza's room and board. Amelia had to wear clothes from the church bazaar. And every night Jerome felt a piece of his soul die when he saw her pretending not to care. It was on one of those nights returning from a delivery in the city's wealthy neighborhood that Jerome passed the Blackstone construction office. The lights were still on the top floor. Richard was working late, probably calculating how much more he could steal. On impulse, Jerome parked and called the company number. Richard Blackstone. The familiar voice answered. It's me, Jerome said simply. Silence. Then a low laugh. Jerome Wells, the man who doesn't know when to quit. I thought prison would teach you humility. I haven't been arrested yet. I appealed the sentence. And how's that working out for you? Richard's voice dripped with satisfaction. I hear you're delivering pizza now. What a fall, huh? From certified accountant to pizza delivery guy. I almost feel sorry for you. Jerome took a deep breath. One day, Richard, you'll pay for everything you've done. Threats now. Richard laughed louder. Record that, Jerome. A former employee convicted of theft threatening his old boss. It'll make for some nice additional evidence when I decide your sentence needs to be extended. The coal dropped. Sitting in his barely functioning used car, Jerome felt something shift inside him. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, more focused. Determination. This man had destroyed his life, harmed entire communities, and still had the audacity to threaten him. Perhaps it was time for Richard Blackstone to discover that he had completely underestimated who he was up against. Jerome wasn't just an accountant. He was an accountant who had grown up on the streets, who understood how the system worked against people like him, and who had a photographic memory for numbers and details that Richard had never imagined. And more importantly, he still had backups that no one knew existed. For 3 months, everyone thought Jerome had been broken by injustice. But anyone watching closely would have noticed that it wasn't defeat that shone in his eyes when he looked at the lights of Richard's office. It was the calculated patience of someone about to teach a lesson the world would never forget. Jerome spent 2 weeks studying the backups he had religiously kept during his years at Blackstone Construction. What he found was far worse than he had imagined. Richard was not just a thief. He was the conductor of a symphony of corruption involving public contracts, local politicians, and a network of shell companies. Sitting on the floor of the tiny room in Dona Esperanza's house with papers scattered around him like an obsessed detective, Jerome mapped out every suspicious transaction. His training in forensic accounting, which Richard had always derided as unnecessary knowledge for a simple accountant, now proved to be his secret weapon. "Dad, are you working on that broken computer again?" Amelia asked, looking at the used laptop Jerome had bought at a flea market for $50. "I'm not working, sweetie. I'm doing a very important puzzle." That was exactly what it was. Each document was a piece, and the picture that emerged showed that Richard had stolen not only from the company but from public schools, hospitals, daycare centers. $16 million embezzled over 8 years. Money that should have been building hope was filling the offshore bank accounts of a man who drove his Mercedes to dinner at expensive restaurants while children studied in classrooms with leaky roofs. Jerome needed help. Not a lawyer. He couldn't afford one good enough to take on Richard. He needed something money couldn't buy, someone with access and influence. That's when he remembered Detective Marcus Thompson, the older brother of his childhood neighbor. Marcus worked in the financial crimes division of the state police and had a reputation for being incorruptible, a rarity in the department. More importantly, Marcus had grown up in the same neighborhood as Jerome. He understood how the system worked against people like them. The meeting was discreetly arranged at a 24-hour cafe on the outskirts of town. Marcus arrived dressed in civilian clothes, his experienced eyes immediately cataloging every exit, every suspicious person. At 42, he had the weary look of someone who had seen too much of human depravity. "Jerome Wells," Marcus said, shaking his hand firmly. "Danny told me you have something interesting to show me. But I need to warn you. If this is about your conviction, I can't get involved." "It's not about my conviction," Jerome replied calmly. "It's about who really should have been convicted." For 2 hours, Jerome methodically presented his research. Documents, spreadsheets, bank transfer patterns, fraudulent contracts. Marcus took notes silently, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "Christ," Marcus muttered when Jerome finished. This is a money-laundering machine disguised as a construction company. How many people know about this?" "Just you and me." Richard thought he had destroyed all the evidence when he framed me. He didn't know I always backed everything up on external drives. "Why?" Jerome smiled for the first time in months. "My father always said, a black man in a position of responsibility needs to document everything twice because someone will always try to say you did something wrong." Paranoia that saved my life. Marcus closed his notebook. "Jerome, what you have here could take down 6 powerful people. Richard, some city councillors, maybe even the mayor. Do you understand what that means? It means I can finally prove my innocence. It means you could end up dead before you get to court." But Jerome had already considered the risks. Over the next few weeks, he and Marcus worked in secret building a bulletproof federal case. Marcus had connections at the FBI, agents specializing in public corruption who were fascinated by the extent of Richard's scheme. Meanwhile, Richard continued to completely underestimate Jerome. The man's arrogance was almost comical. He had begun giving interviews to local newspapers about the importance of trusting the right employees and how to identify signs of dishonesty in the workplace. In one of these interviews, he even mentioned Jerome by name. The Wells case was a perfect example. Richard told the Herald Tribune reporter. Sometimes you give someone from a humble background a chance, offer them opportunities they've never had, and they just can't resist the temptation. It's sad, but it's an important lesson about character. Jerome read the interview on his phone while waiting for the bus to his delivery shift. The anger he felt was cold, calculated. Richard wasn't just celebrating destroying his life. He was using his destruction as a personal marketing opportunity. That night, Jerome called the number he had found in Blackstone Construction's records, a corporate phone account that Richard used for his most sensitive transactions. The number was listed as emergencies in internal documents. "Hello." Richard's voice sounded irritated. "It's me again," Jerome said simply. A pause. "Jesus Christ. Jerome. You never learn. How many times am I going to have to explain to you how the world works? Actually, Richard, I'm beginning to understand exactly how the world works, especially how bank transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands work." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "I don't know what you're talking about," Richard finally replied, but his voice had lost all its arrogant confidence. "Account number 4479-885-2391. Bank International of Nassau. Current balance approximately 4.2 million. Shall I continue?" Jerome could practically hear Richard's brain processing, trying to figure out how the hell Jerome could have access to that information. "You're bluffing. Transaction of $340,000 on March 15, 2023. Source: overpriced contract for the renovation of Roosevelt Elementary School. Destination: your personal account through the shell company Sunshine Holdings LLC. Still think I'm bluffing this time?" The silence lasted for almost a minute. "What do you want?" Richard finally asked, his voice now. "I want you to know that the game has changed. For 8 months, you thought you had won. You destroyed my life, separated a daughter from her father, stole money from children who needed decent schools, and worst of all, you used my destruction to promote yourself. Jerome, listen." "No, Richard, you're the one who's going to listen now. During all these years working for you, I documented every irregularity, every suspicious transaction, every compromising conversation. You thought you knew me, but you never bothered to find out what kind of person I really am." Richard's breathing became heavier. "If you have something, why didn't you use it in your defense?" Jerome smiled in the dark. "Because sometimes revenge needs to be served at the right time, and your time is coming." The coal was cut off. Marcus was right. What Jerome had was too explosive to be ignored. But there was a problem. Proving that the documents were authentic would be complicated, especially considering that Jerome was officially a convicted criminal. They needed something more, some outside validation that would make the case indisputable. That's when the universe decided to intervene in a completely unexpected way. Jerome was making a pizza delivery in an upscale neighborhood when he saw the black BMW parked in front of an elegant house. His heart almost stopped. It was the same car. He was sure of it. The woman in the rain. The woman he had helped 3 weeks before his conviction. On impulse, he parked across the street and waited. 20 minutes later, she came out of the house. Even from a distance, Jerome immediately recognized her posture, the way she carried her briefcase, the quiet authority in her every movement. She got into the BMW and drove toward downtown. Jerome followed her, keeping a safe distance, his heart pounding. The BMW stopped in front of the county courthouse. The sign on the reserved parking space read, "Honorable Kendall Morrison, Superior Court Judge." Jerome sat in his delivery truck, watching the woman he had helped in the rain walk up the courthouse steps with her leather briefcase and professional attire. The same woman who had warmly thanked him for his kindness was a judge, a federal judge. And suddenly, Jerome realized that the universe had given him something much more powerful than documentary evidence. It had given him a human connection to someone in a position of real power. Someone who had seen his character in a moment of adversity and witnessed his integrity when nothing forced him to help. That night, sitting on the floor of Dona Esperanza's room, Jerome looked at Amelia sleeping peacefully and finally allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in months. Real hope. Richard Blackstone had completely underestimated who he was up against. In his arrogance, he had created his own enemy. Jerome wasn't just an accountant with compromising documents. He was a man of integrity with explosive evidence, allies in the legal system, and now an unlikely connection to the judiciary that could change everything. What Richard didn't understand was that when you destroy a good man's life, you're not just creating an enemy, you're creating someone with absolutely nothing to lose and every reason in the world to fight. And Jerome Wells, the man who stopped in the rain to help a stranger, was about to teach a lesson in character that the entire city would never forget. For 8 months, everyone thought Jerome had been broken by injustice. But in fact, he was simply waiting for the perfect moment to show that true strength doesn't shout. It acts with surgical precision when the right moment arrives. The next morning, Richard Blackstone woke up to 14 missed calls from the FBI. Federal agents were at the Blackstone construction office with search and seizure warrants. His digital files, bank accounts, and correspondence were being systematically and ruthlessly confiscated. Mr. Blackstone said Special Agent Torres, showing his badge and legal documents, "You are under arrest for federal tax fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to embezzle public funds." Handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists as employees and customers looked on in shock. The man who had destroyed Jerome for stealing thousands was being arrested for stealing millions. But the real bombshell exploded 2 hours later. Jerome was in the FBI interrogation room, not as a suspect, but as a key witness. Marcus stood by, smiling discreetly as Jerome methodically presented 8 years of documentary evidence that Richard thought he had destroyed. Fraudulent contracts, systematic overbilling, shell companies, Jerome calmly explained to the agents. 16 million embezzled from public projects, schools, hospitals, daycare centers, all documented. Richard, watching through the one-way mirror with his lawyer, finally understood the magnitude of his arrogance. The simple accountant he had despised and framed had methodically built the case that would destroy him completely. How did he get all this? Richard muttered, incredulous. His lawyer was analyzing the documents. "Richard, this here, you're completely screwed. They have everything. Every transaction, every offshore account, every forged document you used against him." The irony was delicious. Richard had used fake documents to incriminate Jerome for a minor crime. Jerome used real documents to expose Richard for massive federal crimes. That afternoon, the story exploded across the news. Businessman convicted of million-dollar embezzlement. Black employee wrongfully imprisoned exposes corruption scheme. The man who had given interviews about character and how to spot dishonesty was in the headlines as the perfect example of corporate hypocrisy. Richard's bank account was frozen. The company was shut down. Contracts were cancelled. Within 48 hours, an empire built on corruption had completely collapsed. Jerome received an unexpected call. Jerome Wells. The voice was familiar, professional. "I'm Judge Kendall Morrison. I'd like to talk to you in person about your case." In the court office, face to face, they finally recognized each other officially. The woman in the rain and the man who had stopped to help. "You recognized me in court," Jerome said. "From day one. And you recognized me too, didn't you?" Jerome nodded. "But you never said anything. Because I knew that if you mentioned our connection, I would have to recuse myself from the case and your case would end up in the hands of someone who might not look at the evidence with the same attention to detail." She slid documents across the table. "Your conviction has been overturned officially with a formal apology from the state and financial compensation for wrongful imprisonment." Jerome looked at the papers, his hands trembling slightly. "And Richard 22 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole for the first 15 years. Meanwhile, Richard was in his temporary cell, finally understanding that he had completely underestimated the man he had destroyed. Jerome wasn't just an accountant with a good memory. He was a strategist who had turned every injustice into fuel for perfect revenge. Richard had used the system to oppress a man of integrity. Jerome used the truth to expose a corrupt system. The difference between them was not just one of character. It was one of strategic intelligence. But the real twist was yet to come. Because Jerome had one last card up his sleeve that would turn this legal victory into something much bigger. A change that would benefit thousands of people who, like him, had been wronged by a system that favored power over truth. 6 months later, Jerome Wells signed a contract as Director of Auditing for the Federal Prosecutor's Office. His salary was 3 times what he earned at Blackstone, and his first mission was to lead a national task force against corporate corruption. Daddy has a big office now. Amelia announced to anyone who would listen, and there's a sign on the door with his name on it. Richard Blackstone, on the other hand, had lost everything. The mansion was auctioned off to pay damages. His wife filed for divorce and moved to another state with their children. He now shared a cell with other white-collar criminals, discovering daily that in prison, money and connections protect no one. Judge Kendall Morrison made a point of attending Jerome's inauguration ceremony. Sometimes, she said in her speech, justice takes time to find its way, but when it does, it is absolute. Jerome looked at Amelia in the front row wearing her best dress and holding a handmade sign. My dad is a real hero. Next to her, Dona Esperanza cried with pride. The man who had stopped in the rain to help a stranger discovered that kindness and integrity were not weaknesses. They were superpowers in a world that had forgotten their value. Richard tried to destroy Jerome for exposing corruption, but ended up creating his own nemesis. Jerome proved that the best revenge is not to repay the evil suffered, but to achieve success that his enemies could never imagine. 3 years later, when Jerome's case became required reading in business ethics courses, one phrase became famous. A man of integrity with evidence is more dangerous to a corrupt person than any army. If this story of justice and overcoming adversity touched your heart, subscribe to the channel because sometimes helping a stranger in a storm is planting the seed of your own salvation.